I'm Alex. Welcome to my shop in Las Vegas, Nevada. This is part 2 of the challenge to create a coffee table with a rising top. And I'm happy to report that so far a success, and this isn't a failure video. So, picking up from where I left off on the last video, at that point I think I had the table base held together with clamps. At this point, the rails, the lower rails, have been glued together, so now I have a complete base. I also cut my shelf, my lower shelf, and it's 1/2-inch plywood, and then I faced the visible plywood edges with just some thin 1/4-inch strips of poplar, and finished off that tabletop and then glued it in position. At that point, I knew I wanted these lifting arms, and so I took 2-inch wide material and started to rough these in, and I knew I was going to use bearings on these ends of the lifting arms, and so with the dado blade I actually relieved a little bit of material off the ends of these so that I could put this 1/8-inch thick flat iron and embed it into the wood itself, secure it with screws, and then drill for my bearing, the bolts for to hold the bearings in place. And then I did a little relief on the end of those so that I maintained a plane underneath the tabletop. I then built the blocks for the arms to pivot from, and I made them big enough to kind of make sure that it influences these arms so they don't tend to drift side to side when they're in place. Also, on the pilot hole for the lift arm, I epoxied in brass bushings to fit my steel pins. So I've got brass bushings on the end of these that are riding in these pivots, and so over time I won't tend to have a failure in the pivot or get slop in there due to the wood wearing away from the friction of it rotating on that pivot. After I did get the shelf in place and my pivot blocks built, I was able to size my arms to fit in the space allotted, and then that allowed me to mock up my pivot blocks and my arms and start to determine where I wanted my gas shocks to be mounted. And one of the first things I noted was that the shocks were going to have to be mounted below the plane of this lower shelf, and the reason for that was I only have about 3 to 3.5 inches travel here, but I wanted at least 6 to 8 or more inches of travel on this end. And looking at the placement of these shocks and the angle of which these shocks are to the arm, it became apparent that the shock needed to be mounted much lower than the shelf plane. And so what I ended up doing, excuse me, on the inside of the lower rails, I just put some spacers, and then I applied these couple of pieces of oak to span that width, and that gave me a surface well below the shelf where I could create pillow blocks for the lower parts of the gas shocks to ride in. The other thing I ended up doing was not only did I use these barrel nuts for the plunger end of these gas shocks, but I also ended up using them on the lower end of the gas shock and put them in pillow blocks. And this did a couple things for me. These gas shocks have a lot of pressure, and the side-mounted pivots over time can develop a little slop, and they can even fail and the post actually come off of its base. The other thing it did was allow me to keep my shocks in plane with my lift arms, which reduced the amount of width that I needed to deal with, so I didn't lose a bunch of space in the center of the lower shelf. On the lift arms themselves, like I said, I've got a piece of flat iron so that my bearing is never going to change its position. It's always going to stay true. The brass bushing down below, so my pivot will always be a nice, well-fit pivot point. And then I added these little pieces on both of these lift arms, and over time, these just kind of influence these arms not to warp over time. And the other thing it does is I went from top to bottom on these, and that spans the whole width of this lift arm, so that in the event there was ever a crack or a failure, it's not going to be catastrophic because it is contained. It's not going to let this blow apart. Now all my lift components is oak, solid oak. I like that because over time it tends to stay straight, it doesn't warp, and it's very strong. And so, you know, if you're attempting this yourself, you know, it doesn't matter what your table is actually made of, but your lifting components, I really recommend oak, just for the strength, the durability, and its ability over time to maintain its dimensions. And you cut a piece of oak, it stays straight pretty much over the life of it. So with this lifting mechanism, I have no doubt it's still going to be operating long before I'm gone. As for the tabletop itself, I started worrying that if I just took my posts that were going to lift my tabletop, if I just tried to fasten them to the underside of a table, that was going to be a weak point. You never get a very strong bond, as it were. It doesn't take much torque, especially when you have a long post, to make that joint fail. And so I decided to take 3/4 inch thick plywood, to furniture grade pine plywood, and actually embed my posts through that wood and secure it with glue, and leave the tops a little proud so that when I skinned the real material that's going to be the finished part of the tabletop over it, I would have some additional material to secure it, just for mechanical strength. So at that point what I did was, once I had my lifting mechanism all worked out and in the positions I wanted it, I took my plywood, basically the subtop, and cut it to finished dimension size, and then I clamped it in place on top of the tabletop. And that allowed me to drill a hole over each hole in these legs, and then with a flush mounting router bit, I was able to duplicate the leg cavity identically into the top of the subtop of the table. Then again, using oak, I created my posts to ride in the legs, and I actually made them about an 1/8 inch bigger in both dimensions, which gave me the ability to taper this end a little bit so that when I placed it down through the sub top, I would be able to apply glue and actually use a mallet and set them in position, and I had a very, very strong surface mounting system that will stay stable over time. And I actually left those posts about 1 inch proud on the subtop, and then trimmed those down. But even with it exposed, when I do put the final skin on this tabletop, I'll recess those posts in. I'll use epoxy, and that'll even offer more additional strength to keep those posts oriented and not fail over time if there were ever any kind of torque put on it that might want to stress or break those joints. On the underside of the tabletop itself, where the bearings are, see, I just put a couple of strips of its thin aluminum material, inch wide, but it's only a 1/16 of an inch thick, and I don't need strength, I just need something metallic for these bearings to ride in, so over time that these bearings don't wear a trough into the wood and we start to lose the ability for it to latch and latch securely and just develop slop over time. So at this point, my top fits. My posts are actually quite long. They're about twice as long as they're visible right now. I did treat them with a paste wax so that they're slippery inside the legs, and my tabletop lowers and raises smooth, and I'm very happy with that. This was one of those points in the build where you put it all together and it's either going to work or it didn't work, and in this case I'm quite happy to report that it's working. Now, one consideration I have is I thought I had a lot of excess pressure that I was going to have to worry about on these gas shocks, and the case in point is no, it's just going to be about right. In fact, when I skin the top of this top, I'm going to end up with maybe 3/8 of an inch thick material, and what I'm trying to do is keep the weight down. I've actually been piling wood on this to see how much weight I can actually raise, and so at this point I thought I'd be trying to make it heavier so that my gas shocks weren't too powerful. At this point I'm trying to make sure that I keep my materials for my tabletop light enough so that I still have the ability to lift items that are on here and not be too slow. What I will end up doing is there will be a skirt of some sort around the perimeter of this, and then I want to fill the interior with pine to maintain the species that I've chosen for this table. And then once that's done, I'll be able to start looking at the way I want to latch this tabletop in place. And what I'm thinking at this point is the skirts on the ends of this table will probably provide me an excellent location to put some kind of locking pin that comes out through the side of the table and locks the skirt in place. Now I can't lock the arms because that would leave the tabletop free to just be lifted off. So the tabletop itself has to incorporate the locking mechanism. I need to lock the tabletop down. And so at this point I'm thinking some kind of latching post that will go through the sides of the end of this table will latch the tabletop in place. The other thing it does is it will let me produce or install mechanics to latch and unlatch this still in the center line of this table, so that when I do put my little pieces of thin ply to cover my mechanics in the center here, that it's all contained and not visible. The other thing it will do is we won't be able to reach under here and unlatch this tabletop from the underside. You'll have to activate the lock via this lever. As far as how much room I lost in the center line of this, it's right now at about 3 1/4 inches total that I've lost down the center line of this. I did leave about 3/8 of an inch clearance between the two lifting arms, but it's actually working out quite well because I'm going to get this out of the way. That gives me the ability, whatever kind of latching mechanism I put in here, the activation can either come from underneath because I've got space in here on both sides to make something pivot or pull or somehow retract the pins, but it'll all be kept in the center line here, so it won't be visible. So at this point, I'm still on the road to success. We'll see if that continues. But that pretty much covers part 2 of the challenge of the rising top for this table. I'll probably set about skinning the top so that it's complete, and then at that point I can start to look how I want to actually latch this. Like I said, I've only got ideas at this point, but at the end of the first video, these were just ideas, and these worked out fine, so I'm hoping that my ideas continue to bear fruit, and we'll see where it goes from here, success or failure. Anyway, from Las Vegas, Nevada, I'm Alex. Take care.